This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
So I want to begin by thanking the Young Israel of Woodmere for their hospitality and hosting us this morning. I want to thank Rabbi Yaxelrod and Rav Shechter. And Bez Hashem, we should be together, B'Yerushalayim. I was completely stunned, literally speechless, on Erev Shabbos. So I've been giving a shiur in the Young Israel of Kew Garden Hills for over 10 years to a group of older gentlemen, retirees. And I give the shiur on Wednesday and Friday. And this past Friday before the shiur, there was an announcement. The gentleman who announces before the shiur, the sponsor of the shiur. So the gentleman announced, this week's shiur is sponsored. There are two sponsors this week. Firstly, Jack is sponsoring. Jack is sponsoring Leiloi Nishmas, his son, Daniel. So you hear, this group consists of older gentlemen, grandparents, great-grandparents, and you hear someone sponsoring Leiloi Nishmas, their son, your heart goes out to them. Jack is sponsoring Leiloi Nishmas, his son, whose yahrzeit is Tisha B'Av. And then the man making the announcement, Donald, says, and I'm also sponsoring today's shiur. Okay, so you expect he's sponsoring the shiur, Leiloi Nishmas, his grandmother, his great-grandmother. Donald is sponsoring the shiur, Leiloi Nishmas, his daughter. That's already, call it a day after that. He says, I'm also sponsoring the shiur, Leiloi Nishmas, my daughter, whose yahrzeit is Tisha B'Av. I didn't even know, I was waiting for already the next day. It was 9:30 in the morning, I was waiting for the next day to come. Here are two men, I don't know, in their 80s, one I think in their 90s, mourning the loss of children, both of whose yahrzeit was Tisha B'Av. What could you say after that? But that's what Tisha B'Av means for Klal Yisrael. National disaster and personal tragedy. From the time the Meraglim brought their slanderous report on Eretz Yisrael, 3,300 years ago, and Klal Yisrael cried for naught, this day has been forever seared as the day of tears. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The great city of Beitar was captured on Tisha B'Av. Tornus Rufus plows Yerushalayim. Throughout history, Tisha B'Av has been a lightning rod of Jewish disaster. The great city of Alexandria, which by the way was bigger than Beitar, was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. The Jewish community of England was expelled in the year 1295 on Tisha B'Av. The Abarbanel writes, B'shalachoi, Kole, Goresh, Yegoresh, Kole is Gematria, 1295. That's the year 1295. Kole is 55. That's the year 1295. The Abarbanel writes, the Jews of France were expelled on Tisha B'Av. Of course, we know the Spanish expulsion was scheduled for Tisha B'Av. World War I broke out on Tisha B'Av. I remember right before my bar mitzvah, it was Tisha B'Av Shechali Yos B'Shabbos. I was walking with my father to our shul, Agudas Yisrael Beis Binyamin. We were on Avenue L, on East 29th, and we look ahead, and the shul ve'einenu, it wasn't there anymore, it had burnt down on Tisha B'Av. I have a cousin, he was a Torah guy. He was involved in the community, really a holy Jew. And he contracted a rare illness. He passed away 2 years ago. Erev Tisha B'Av, the Levaya was Tisha B'Av right after the Kinnis. So it's a day of national disaster and a day of personal tragedy. So to hear two old men both mourning the loss of children, both on Tisha B'Av, ma noimar u'ma nadaber. Isn't it enough already? Have we not suffered enough? Do we still need to suffer more? What does the Ribbon Shalom still want from us? A year of COVID-19, we figured, okay, life was coming back to normal, and then blow after blow, Meron, Stalin, Surfside. You would think that we fulfilled our quota. You'd think we would met the quota already. You know, one of the great heroes of the Jewish people, one of the great leaders of the last century, who tried to encourage and to inspire his Talmidim in the darkest of hours, the Piatzetzna Rebbe, Rav Kalonimus Kalman Shapiro of Piatzetzna. And the Rebbe would deliver a drasha every Shabbos, and he would try to elevate the Talmidim, inspire the Talmidim, give them hope, give them courage. He would record his drasha after Shabbos, and then hoping that one day his drasha would survive, and he actually buried the drashos in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was discovered after the war, and it was published in 1960 under the title Eish Kodesh. Here's a drasha the Piatzetzna Rebbe gave in 1941. Chanukah 1941. And the Rebbe basically said as follows: my entire Talmidim, we've been here before. Persecution, humiliation, this is not a new experience, this is not a new phenomenon. We are very well acquainted with this type of life throughout our history. We've been there, we've done that, we've persevered. Don't think this is the first time something like this occurred. This was the drasha he gave, Chanukah 1941. A year later, the 18th of Kislev, 1942, the Rebbe took the drasha and he made an amendation to the drasha. He retracted, he revised his drasha of 1941, and you could see it in the Piatzetzna Rebbe's handwriting. He writes the following footnote: only the suffering up to the end of 1942 was comparable to previous disasters the Jewish people have endured. But since then, since the winter of 1942, the unusual suffering, the cruel barbaric murders, the monstrous torture that they invented for Beis Yisrael, says the Rebbe, in my opinion and in my understanding of Jewish history, never in the long saga of Jewish history did the Jews ever endure anything comparable to what has started to occur after the winter of 1942. Writes the Rebbe, Hashem Yerachem Oleinu Keheref Ayin. I retract my comments of 1941. Ghettos, banning religious activity, humiliation, been there, done that. But the systematic program of extermination, rounding up tens of thousands of Jews and gassing them, killing Jews hundreds of thousands, sometimes in one day, it was sui generis, something mankind and the Jewish people never experienced. No event in the long and painful history of exile can remotely compare to the death camps. And so the Piatzetzna Rebbe revised and retracted the Chanukah drasha of 1941. No, we've never seen this before. The Rebbe said there's nothing that we ever experienced that could give us the perspective to assimilate what's taking place. This change in perspective may shed light on another historical controversy, a controversy that has been brewing for 75 years. We know in 1942 a secret underground resistance movement started to form. Now this underground movement was what you call the odd couple. It was a very disparate group of people. You had left-wing Zionists, you had members of Jabotinsky's right, you had anti-Zionist socialist Bundists, and they all got together and they created a guerrilla force of 1,000 fighters who began to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. And this was the beginning of what is called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Instead of smuggling in food, they smuggled in ammunition, they made homemade grenades. Their motto was, we will no longer be herded into the concentration camps like sheep to the slaughter. We will resist, we will defend Jewish honor. Better to die by a bullet fighting for our lives than perish like sheep in the gas chambers. Even if we're killed, at least we'll take some Nazis with us. The time for revenge has come. However, many in Orthodox circles, particularly in the world of Agudas Yisrael, disapproved of the operation. Some felt the revolt unnecessarily hastened thousands of deaths. Halacha dictates that one is not allowed to expedite the death of even a single life, even by a few moments. It was argued better to continue to hide out in basements and in barns and prolong their survival. By the time 1943 came in the spring, Germany had already been defeated in Stalingrad. They were retreating. The tide had squarely turned. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops had landed in Normandy. And if the Jews could hang on for a bit longer, maybe some of them could survive. Moreover, many believe that taking up arms is not the appropriate Jewish response to crisis. Better than killing Germans, rather focus your attention, tshuva, tefillah, utzedakah. Jewish pride is expressed not through bullets and ammunition, but emunah in the darkest of times. This is a historic, moral, ethical, hashkafic dilemma and controversy that has raged for 75 years. Was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising sanctioned by Gedolei Yisrael? And we want to focus on one specific aspect of the controversy, the opinion of the great Goin, Rav Menachem Zemba. What did Rav Menachem Zemba hold about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Who was Rav Menachem Zemba? He was held in the highest of esteem by Torah Jewry. He was under 40 years old. He had already been offered the prestigious position, Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem. When Rameir Shapiro passed away, he was appointed, he was offered to be Rosh Hashiva of Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin and Rav of Lublin, which he turned down. Before his 40th birthday, he was the honorary secretary of the Moyeses Gedolei HaTorah in Europe. He authored more than 10,000 pages of Chidushei Torah, a commentary on the entire Rambam called Machazeh HaMelech, a commentary on the entire Yushalmi called Menachem Yerushalayim, hundreds of tshuvos and original chidushin on the Bavli, Shulchan Aruch, and the Medrash. Rav Menachem Zemba had a prize student before the Holocaust named Rabbi Simcha Elberg, who escaped from Warsaw before the uprising. He fled to Shanghai with the Mir Yeshiva. He settled in New York. He was a member of the executive board of Agudas Yisrael. He was the executive director of something called Agudas Harabanim, and he was the editor of one of the earliest Torah journals, Hapardes. And Rav Elberg writes as follows. He wrote it in Hebrew in Hapardes in 1959, and it was published in Das Yiddische Wort in Yiddish, with the following note on the bottom that has never again appeared on any article in Das Yiddische Wort. This reflects only the opinion of the author. Never again did the editor of Das Yiddische Wort write that little comment on the bottom of an article. Writes Rabbi Elberg, and I used to hear about Rabbi Elberg from Talmud Chacham in Queens, Rabbi Warman, Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Warman, who is a friend of Rabbi Elberg. Rabbi Elberg writes, and he states emphatically and unequivocally, that Rabbi Menachem Zemba must have opposed the uprising. But what do you mean? The Bar Kochva revolt was defended and supported by none other than Rabbi Akiva himself. Rabbi Akiva was the arm bearers of Bar Kochva. Says Rabbi Elberg, Rabbi Akiva was different. That was a war in Eretz Yisrael. That was in the Jewish homeland against foreign occupation. It had a reasonable chance of success. But says Rabbi Elberg, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was conceived from its beginning as a suicide mission. It was taking place in the Golos. It was only to restore Jewish pride. Such an operation would never be supported by Rabbi Menachem Zemba. On the other hand, since then, many testimonies have since surfaced from the Warsaw Ghetto indicating, contrary to Rav Elberg's assumption, that Rav Menachem Zemba supported the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Rabbi Zechariah Fendel, in his book, From Dusk to Dawn, not to be confused with another book similar to that, cites the testimony of Yehuda Aryeh Feingold, a survivor of the ghetto who published in the Hatsofa newspaper in 1946. Yehuda Aryeh Feingold visited Reb Menachem Zemba and Reb Menachem Zemba's sukkah in 1942. And Reb Zemba said as follows, I am telling you that this is the way to rise up, to oppose through action, with weapons in hand. There are many among us who are opposed to the uprising. This is a foolish tendency in man to think the evil will never reach him. The way I see it, according to halacha, there is a mitzvah in the uprising. Says Rabbi Menachem Zemba, mitamzeh ani royeh shelafi hahalacha mitzvah b'mered b'meitav tachsisei hamilchama. There's a mitzvah to rebel, to use all tactics of war. Kiddush Hashem yesh kan milchemes mitzvahi. Another important source are the well-known Warsaw Ghetto diaries of Rav Hillel Seidman, Talmud Chacham, historian who survived the ghetto, eventually became a journalist in New York, and he writes in his diary, Rabbi Menachem Zemba declares, at least we should not have gone voluntarily to the Umschlagplatz. We should have tried to resist, but we fooled ourselves with wishful thinking. The Germans told us, don't worry, you have wealthy relatives in America who will bail you out. Baruch, Morgenthau, Belashe. So we believe them. Paskin Rabbi Menachem Zemba, there are different ways to Kiddush Hashem, and it depends on the circumstance. In Spain, in the times of the Crusades, where the only way to save ourselves was baptism, then the way to sanctify the name of Hashem was we had to give up our life. However, says Rabbi Menachem Zemba, today the only way to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim is armed resistance. And this is the position that I personally heard from a first-hand source. My grandfather, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, told us many times that Rabbi Menachem Zemba emphatically endorsed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that was a Kiddush Hashem. In fact, my grandfather served as Rabbi Menachem Zemba's personal lookout during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He was uniquely suited for this task because he had exceptionally good vision. In fact, when he reached 100 years old, he once lamented, the hardest part about turning 100 is reading the Rashi Oisi Ois in the Gemara. Quite a disparate difference of opinion between the viewpoint of Rav Simcha Elberg and that of those who personally were in the Warsaw Ghetto. It has been suggested, and this was written by my Yedid, Harav Dov Lokech, that just as the Piaseczna Rebbe retracted and revised his comments after the winter of 1942, and he concluded that in fact the events of the Holocaust have no parallel in the saga of world history, conceivably the events of 1942 may have changed the attitudes of Hagoyin Rabbi Menachem Zemba. Rav Elberg knew and studied under Rabbi Menachem Zemba before the war. Under conventional circumstances, Rabbi Menachem Zemba never would have supported armed resistance. But in 1942, unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures. The systematic attempt to eradicate the Jewish people transcended all familiar halachic and hashkafic principles delineated by previous generations. Rabbi Menachem Zemba's psak may be categorized at what is considered the proper Hayra Asha under an unparalleled, unprecedented attempt to annihilate Klal Yisrael. So we as a nation have already experienced and suffered the indescribable, incomparable, unparalleled. Why do we still need to suffer more? What are we lacking? What does Ribbono Shel Olam still want from us? And here's a thought that's been brewing inside me for some time. The pasuk says in Parshas Re'eh, Ki el hamakoim asher yivchar Hashem Elokeichem mikol shivteichem. Listen carefully to how the Torah describes the Makom HaMikdash. Makom asher yivchar Hashem. Losum es shemoi sham. L'shichnoi sidrashu uvasa shama. Seek out the Beis HaMikdash. There's a seminal Malbim on this pasuk. The Malbim asks, B'chama mekoimois koirei makom HaMikdash makom asher yivchar Hashem. Throughout Tanakh, what is the Mikdash called? The place that God has selected. That's the Mikdash. We don't know where exactly it is. There's no sign. Here is the base of Mikdash. The Mikdash is Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem. And how do you know where it is? Says the Malbim, Ki nizvada al yidei Navi. It is only taught to us by the Navi. Shehu Makom HaNivchar. So in order to know where the Makom HaMikdash is, you need a prophet. The prophet says, here's the Mikdash. Ask the Malbim. So if you need a Navi, and Hashem has to tell you where it is, so why did David HaMelech come running to the Navi and say, Navi, tell me where it is? It's not up to David, it's up to the prophet. Why is David preempting the Navi? Says the Malbim. From here we learn, Mikol Makoim Matzanu Shedavid Darash Acharei HaMakoim. As David HaMelech says, Ad Emtza Makoim Lashem. He didn't wait for the Navi to come. How did David know that even though the Navi was going to say where it is, he has to seek it out? He learned it from this pasuk. L'shichnai sidrashu. You have to be doireshet. Shahadrisha hima shechoiker ba'atzmai limtza es hadavar. Says the Malbim. God will never tell the prophet where to build the Beis HaMikdash until we haggle and we hound the prophet. Where is it going to be? God will choose it, God will select it, God will tell us where it is, only if we harass the Navi. When are you going to tell us? We have to be doiresh the Navi. There's something we need to do that we can't leave up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what do we need to do? Here the pasuk is saying God will be boicher the Mikdash, but only if we're doiresh the Mikdash. So what do you need to do? Do you need to go there? Not allowed to go there. So how are you doiresh the Mikdash? Listen to the following pasuk in Yirmiyah. Ki ele aruch alach. I will heal you, says Hashem. And from your wound I will cure you. Ki nidacha karulach. Tzion hi doiresh ein la. She is Tzion. No one seeks her out. Listen to these words. 5 words. Tzion hi doiresh ein la. Says the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara in Sukkah, Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. Miklal deboi drisha. You must seek her out. She ain't coming back to us until you seek her out. Tzion hi doiresh ein la miklal deboi drisha. You must seek her out. So what does that mean? How do you seek out Tzion? I've been wondering about this for 8 years since I saw the Malbim. How are you doiresh Tzion? And this year I bought a sefer on Zmiros from Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And Reb Chaim Kanievsky writes on Baruch Kel Elyon, V'hu yidroish l'tzion. I was very excited. He has a comment on these words. V'hu yidroish l'tzion. Says Reb Chaim, you want to know what it means to be doiresh Tzion? You need to look at Targum Unklis on the word drisha in Tanakh. Where do we have the word edroish? V'ach es dimchem lenafshoisechem edroish. I will seek out the blood of the murderer. Miyad kol chaya edrishenu. Umiyad ha'adam miyad ish achiv edroish. We have the word doiresh 3 times. Says Targum Unklis. Uberam yazdimchain lenafshoisechain esba. Miyad kol chaysa esbeina. Umiyad ensha, miyad gevar diyeshoid, yosdama da'achoi esba. Doiresh means to be toiveya. Where else do we have this? Vayisroitzu habonim bikirba v'atoimer imkein lamazeh anoichi v'atelech lidroish es Hashem, says Targum Onkelos, ve'azalas lemizba ulfan min kadam Hashem. Doiresh means to be toiveya, to claim, to mun, to demand. Tzion hi, doiresh ein la. No one demands tzion. Meklal deboi drisha. From here we learn, says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, we must be toiveya tzion. Yeah, we daven. V'shalayim ercha barachmem tashav. V'ansham bil Yerushalayim. And if not, okay, so at least I want to make a few bucks. I want to have a good supper tonight. Hamha, we don't demand it. We say the words. Tzion hi doiresh ein la meklal debai drisha. What does drisha mean? You have to be toiveya it. Says Reb Chaim, if you look in the Yalkut Shimoni on Shmuel, in the times of David HaMelech, he lost the lives of many soldiers. Why did they die? Says the Medrash, Sheloi tavu es binyan beis hamikdash. Ask the Medrash, but they never saw a Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash wasn't built yet. Says the Medrash, v'haloi dvarim ka v'chaymer. Uma elu shloi rou es Beis HaMikdash kach, anu al achas kama v'kama. If people who never saw a Mikdash were held liable for not demanding the Mikdash, we know what a Mikdash was. We have to be toiveya. Therefore, says the Medrash, Hiskinu neviim harishonim she Yisrael mispalim b'chol yom shloisha pa'amim hashev shchinascha l'tzion. It's well known that after the Brisker Rav was the Rav in Slutsk, he wanted to retire. Can't imagine why a rabbi would want to retire, but then he was offered the prestigious position of Rav of Brisk. 25,000 Yidden living in the city of Brisk. Brisker Rav felt, after spending a long career in Rabbanos, he would be able to learn, to write, to have some menuchas hanefesh without the oil of Rabbanos. And a messenger came to the Beis HaLevi and he says, Beis HaLevi, I don't understand. 25,000 Jews are asking you to take the job. And the Beis HaLevi turns to his wife and he says, give me my kapata. If they're asking me, I can't keep them waiting. I can't refuse them. And the Chafetz Chaim would say over this story. And the Chafetz Chaim would say, if the Brisker Rav could not turn down 25,000 Jews who were waiting and asking him, then how does Mashiach keep us waiting for so many hundreds of years? But we're waiting for him. We're asking him. And the Chafetz Chaim says, Zet min defun, we're not waiting for him. And we're not asking him. We're not waiting. We're not asking. We live our lives, we go to our jobs, we build our homes, and we say, Mashiach, let me know when you come, let me know when you're here. Says the Chafetz Chaim, if we would really be waiting, if we would demand it, then the Rebbeinu Shalom couldn't turn us down. This is a teaching that is explicitly mentioned in the work of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari. Kuzari, of course, records the dialogue between a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jewish scholar with the king of the Khazars. He was searching for the true religion. And the king was finally convinced of the authenticity of Judaism, but he had one pickpock on the practice of the Jewish people. He had one question to the king, to the Jewish scholar. He said, all day long you pray to return to Tzion, to rebuild Yerushalayim, v'sachazenu einenu. To me it seems like it's just lip service. It's just like tziftzuf hazarzir, the chirping of a bird. And the Jewish scholar conceded, you're right, we don't really mean it. We just mouth the words. And the Kuzari then writes the following promise to the Jewish people. He says, Im hayinu mizamnim atzmeinu likras elokei avoseinu b'leivav shalem uvenefesh chafetza. If we would only prepare ourselves to return to Hashem wholeheartedly and wholesomely, says the Kuzari, I promise, hayinu poigim mimenu mashapagu avoseinu b'mitzrayim. The Rebbeinu Shalom would redeem us immediately like He redeemed us from Egypt. But says the Kuzari, we don't ask for it, and we're not waiting for it. Have we suffered enough? We've suffered enough a long time ago. We've had our fair share a very long time ago. What then do we need to do? Says the Navi Yirmiyah, Tzion hi doiresh ein la. No one is toiveya tzion. We don't demand it, and we don't ask for it. But if we would come to Rebbeinu Shalom, the Sishkoin B'Soicha Kasher Dibarta, Rebbeinu Shalom, you owe it to us. You said, Kasher Dibarta. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom would say, you didn't even have to ask. You don't have to be Doiresh. It's Makoim Asher Yivchar Hashem. I've already selected it. But to hear those words, you first have to be Doiresh. And if we are, we'll all be Zoicha to see B'nei Chamas, Tzion, Yerushalayim, Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.